In the past, when we got bad news, we were already in community because somebody would have come to tell you. You were already in community when bad news happened. Right now, we're getting all our bad news on the phone, alone. How do we grieve together in this time? Rather than just consuming all of this and go, I don't know what to do with all of this by myself. You're not supposed to be by yourself, I don't think. I think you're supposed to grieve together.
Welcome to Sleeping Around, where we offer a peek behind the curtain of modern sex and relationship therapy and research, bringing you insights and conversations otherwise reserved for the therapy room. I'm your host, Alayna Joy, a Master's of Counseling Psychology student, content creator, and lifelong sex and relationship nerd. Enjoy the episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Sleeping Around. Today, we are joined by Bhupie and Abby, the co-creators of Prospect Counselling and Training, a queer, POC-led counseling practice dedicated to providing accessible and exceptional counseling to SDQT BIPOC plus communities. A practice that, rather than building wealth for the practice owners, the proceeds from services provide support for further training, thereby enhancing the services you receive while funding projects for collective healing within the community. And today, we are discussing the question, are we all traumatized? And if we are, what can we do about it? What can we do about it in therapy? What can we do about it outside of therapy? This episode, in its own way, feels like an open letter to therapists and those who go to therapy combined. We really get into healing and the different forms that healing can take. In the extended cut over on Patreon, we dive even further into the idea of self-care as a whole. And overall, during this conversation, Bhupie and Abby really deconstruct for us a lot of these widely held beliefs that we have around trauma and around healing. Abby is a cis queer, working turned middle class, currently non-disabled, straight-sized settler from Hong Kong. She runs Venturous Counseling, which is a BIPOC counseling collective, offering beyond the talk practices for intersectional anti-carceral feminist therapy, and also reflecting on Justice, a mutual aid and educational platform for therapists to unlearn systemic oppression in community. And Bhupie is a cis, fat, currently non-disabled, middle-class settler whose ancestors are from India. She is a therapist, supervisor, professor, and consultant, and along with Abby has co-founded Prospect Counselling, like I talked about earlier. I hope that you all really take in what we talk about throughout this episode. And of course, enjoy it. Thanks for listening. First things first, can you tell us a little bit about Prospect Counselling and Training? How it got started, what brought the two of you to this work? Tell us a little bit about you.
Prospect Counseling, I think I've always visioned a space where we can deconstruct some ideas around our profession, our work, hold each other in that process with accountability and generativity and kindness and compassion. Not be afraid to have the hard conversations. Sometimes in different kinds of spaces of working, that's not possible in the same ways. And then on top of it, to be able to have a space for, BIPOC folks in particular, where they can come and access lower cost counseling. And so this was kind of an idea, a little teeny tiny idea. And Abby and I got connected by our mutual supervisor, Vicky, and we did some teaching together and our friendship grew and this idea was shared. I shared it to Abby. I usually share it with everybody because I'm like, I don't know, something might happen. And she was so excited and like the energy force behind it, because I held it for like 10 years almost, right?
Oh, wow.
And yeah, she's such an energetic force in this kind of space with me, at least, that she's like, let's do it. And here we are now. And it's kind of evolved and shaped based on, some of her reflections, some of her guidance, but also some of the community members that we're connected with and the students that have been involved. And some of the folks are, what that we call quote unquote clients who've come along and shaped this. So I guess that's kind of our starting origin story, I guess. I feel like now we're like some sort of Marvel character or something. I don't know.
Oh,
Yeah, I think we kind of started out as human beings really connected on the ethics of this work and really trying to cultivate a different space.
I'm a fan. I subscribe to your newsletter. I've watched different talks that the two of you have given. And something that comes up is this idea of liberatory practice and anti-oppression, right? Anti-oppressive counseling. I'm doing air quotes to the folks who are just listening. This kind of language that sounds really nice. It sounds really important. It sounds like something we want to strive for. But what do those things actually look like in practice? What do they really mean? And how do you implement?
I think one of the things is like these are really fancy words, and what we're trying to really talk about is go beyond, conversations that we have around. Well, first of all, I guess let's backtrack. Is to recognize the context in which we are living our lives, experiencing our lives, and have as individuals and as communities, and on a larger scale. And what I mean by that is that this isn't some sort of vacuum that we're living in. There's a context in which we live our lives. So the problem is often those things are very much invisibilized. We don't notice them. We don't pay attention to them. It's kind of like the analogy that people give, like, do fish really understand that they're in water when they're in water all the time? And so it's kind of like the air we're breathing all the time. And if you're not aware of the air that you're breathing, you just think it's normal. However, the air that we're breathing is hurting us in some ways. And if we don't figure that out, we might just start to blame ourselves because we don't notice, hey, there's something actually going on in the air rather than my lungs being a problem or whatever it might be that we, if we're playing along with this analogy. So it's really important to recognize some of these systemic things that are going on that actually aren't just systems. So when we talk about, I'm just going to say it, white supremacy, which we actually mean is colonialism, which is because we're on colonized land and genocide continues to happen, all of those things. When we talk about white supremacy, when we talk about ableism, when we talk about cis-heteronormativity, all of these kinds of things, sometimes they're seen as like big, large ideas that kind of exist out there. But all of those things trickle down into the smaller, systems, if we want to use that kind of language, where it comes to the individual too. So those things exist in the air we breathe, but they shape the institutions that we're, part of, including like education, media, banking, law, criminal system, all of those kinds of systems, but also our communities on a smaller level, and then also our smaller communities that might be like family or friends, and then us as individuals. So it's a conversation about really recognizing how those ideologies in which we built this culture and this framework really impact all of us in everyday kind of situations, which we call maybe, quote unquote, depression or, relationship difficulties or trauma even, right? The idea of trauma being located within me in my nervous system is a flawed idea. We need to kind of, not that that isn't something to consider. I'm not saying don't consider anything that's kind of impacting us, but we also have to look outside and see where is the harm actually coming from, and where does the healing also actually come from? It's not just within me, it's also relationally. Harm happens relationally, healing happens relationally. I just wanted to kind of take it back for a moment and recognize the importance of why we're having these conversations in the first place, because often we will start to kind of go, oh, my thought patterns are problematic, or my body is problematic, my mind body is problematic. That's where the problem lies, and I need to change that. And we never really look at outside of that and recognize maybe some of the things that do actually need to change so that as a society, we're more healthy or whatever kind of language we want to use it, or in wellness together versus putting it on individual people to do some work that needs to happen, but never really address the actual issue.
I'm holding two things that I imagine the both of you hold and navigate every single day as you work as therapists. And most of that work, a lot of that work is done individually, one-on-one. How do you hold both of those things, that this is a much larger problem. This is the air that we are breathing. The problem is not our functioning, our bodies, our thoughts. The problems are bigger than us. They're outside of ourselves. We are drowning in it at times. I'm speaking from a place of, I think a lot of us are feeling helpless right now, feeling hopeless, feeling like I see these problems. I see what's happening and it's scary and I don't know what I can do.
The frame that I like to use is that liberatory practice is shifting our profession from a symptom reduction profession to a world building profession. And I think when we think of like helplessness, we're assuming that we're not actually actors in the system, that we don't have power in the system. And a lot of times we don't, or at least not as much, right? But I think that this is a quote by Steve Biko: the most powerful weapon in the minds for the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed. Something along those lines.
Ooh. Uh-huh.
And so the way that I think when I say world building profession, when we're sitting one-on-one with someone, we can deconstruct some of these systems that are in place and also think about what kind of systems we want to cultivate. And those systems that we end up cultivating are in the relationships that we have with each other, in the pockets of communities that are being built just by us living in a different way, right? And so when we say the professional is personal, or like it starts with us, like this is kind of what we mean by that. If we can shift those understandings, if we can recognize that capitalism is influencing us and we refuse to participate in the same ways, or maybe we find resistances in that, eventually enough of us will get along that that's no longer going to be a system that's viable anymore. I think Leanne Simpson calls this changing the air. And when we lean into that piece, then it doesn't feel so hopeless anymore. Because we can do relationship. We could do individual change, right? Those pieces are very much within our grasp.
So you're saying that part of the answer lies in our community, the people around us, the way that we relate to others?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's such power in community. Oppression is a system that's kind of been existing for quite some time. And we are alive here because of our ancestors being in connection with each other and figuring some stuff out, right? Like there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge in communities and in connection. And I think often if we start to individualize everything, it starts to feel more hopeless and helpless because we don't realize how connected we are together and how interconnected we are. And so community itself is a whole larger piece. It's not just like, oh, we're going to have some conversations, but sometimes it is. You know what I mean? How do we hold each other up? How do we support each other? How do we get through this time together? How do we be creative? How do we dream? How do we imagine some other possibilities and have those happen? But also, how do we cry together? And how do we be in struggle together? I also think this piece around individual work is really interesting. We do sometimes sit with the individual, but I've often also invited other people into the therapy room in multiple ways, whether it's physically or metaphorically, or it's the conversation about how do we address some of the struggles that folks are kind of working through. Is it just an individual response? Sometimes it's about how do you connect more with your community and how do you create more of the spaces that you're looking for, or be connected to more of that. There's lots of ways we can kind of invite community and connection within the individual conversation, alongside, of course, like Abby's talking about, building relationships, and all of those things matter as well, because we become part of their community in some way too.
It's a two-way relationship. It's not I, the therapist, sit on one side as expert, you, the quote-unquote client, sit on the other side as sufferer, and together we are going to cure you.
Oh, that gives me the ick in so many ways.
I know. I was like, what's the grossest word I could possibly say? Yeah, what you're saying feels a lot more hopeful. And as a therapist listening to this, or as a therapist in training, as a client listening, what does that actually look like? What are the steps you can take? Where can you start?
I think based off of what you just said around like me being the person who's got it all figured out and the client being the one who's like broken and, you know, that kind of stuff, I think it starts there, really deconstructing that idea. I just feel like we need to talk about that a little bit is often in our profession, we're kind of put up in this space of being an expert, even though we're taught not to be the expert, but we're taught to be the expert, right? Like we talk about clients being experts of their own lives. And yet, in so many ways, we're trained to be experts and guiding people towards this solution or this kind of way of being or this kind of... So we really need to deconstruct that idea of our profession. We also need to deconstruct that idea it's supposed to be a fully one-sided relationship. And I'm not saying that, you know, there aren't any boundaries. There are some boundaries in place, of course. And there are places where we are still centering our clients. But I can imagine a lot of people listening right now can think of times and many times when you're working with folks and they say something absolutely brilliant that changes your own life, you know, that brings some insight into things that you never thought of because you're listening to their wisdom and you're learning from them as well. And I'm not saying, again, I'm sitting there telling, you know, my client to teach me all these things, but just by making space for clients to be experts of their own lives, to share their own wisdom, to figure out their own path in that with some level of maybe conversation and where it's kind of you know, there's a dialogue between people, of course, that brilliance comes through. And of course that brilliance is going to shape us.
So as a potential client, what are some things you can look out for? If you're looking for a therapist, maybe you're on a practice website and the website has all of the right words, quote unquote, LGBTQ friendly, anti-oppressive, sex positive, right? All the right language. What are some things that you could actually look for in, let's say, a consultation to find out, to feel out if this is the right fit for you?
I think one of the things is you can ask questions, but also like notice what they do, like how they're operating in therapy with you. Like, are they asking, where are these things coming from? Are they willing to critique systems with you? Do they even know what systems are impacting them, impacting the practice, impacting the problems that you're experiencing? They're impacting the context that you exist in. Are they willing to talk about that? Or, you know, like, have they done their own work around that? Right? Like, that's a good question. When I look for a therapist, that's what I ask, right? Like, what do you think about capitalism and the ways that, you know, that impacts our self-worth and the ways that we live and all that stuff? And what is their answer to that? Do they have an answer to that? Those are things that you can start with. One thing that I ask a lot in my practice is, where does that come from? And then going beyond, oh, my parents or my childhood. It's like, okay, but where did they learn that from? Right? So like, how is your therapist actually bringing in these systemic contexts and looking at how that impacts your life? What does that look like? How do we, you know, take it all apart and then make something else with it, right? Is that a process that you're having in your sessions right now?
I feel like often we also get a sense. Our bodies kind of respond and go, there's something off there. And to listen to that and to lean into that. And then the other piece is, like, for me, when we talk about anti-oppression or trauma-informed and all of these fancy words, a big piece that comes up for me is consent, autonomy, and dignity. And so how is consent showing up in your therapy, you know, for clients to consider? Is it just the confidentiality form that you sign and you're like, okay, consent is done? Or is it a continual process? Is your therapist checking in with you around how things are going or what you're about to do? Do you feel like you have enough information to decide, yes, this is the path I want to go on? Do you feel like Abby's saying, contextualized some of these things? Have you had a chance to talk about the invisible, you know, the things that we don't often talk about? Because when we say consent, you can truly only consent when you have all the information that you need to make a decision. So if there's a whole bunch of information you haven't explored, are you actually consenting? Consenting to a direction for therapy, consenting to a way to kind of approach whatever the struggle is. And when we think about sex therapy, sometimes even the conversation about what is sex, like comes up, and where do we get those ideas, and like really contextualizing some of this stuff instead of going, okay, let's just kind of move ahead and make a whole bunch of assumptions. And maybe even like not even the therapist might be going on their own assumptions even, right? Like, and just kind of going ahead and saying, this is what we're going to do. But really taking the time to contextualize so you can have more of that consent moving forward.
So the 3 pieces you said: consent, autonomy, and dignity?
Mm-hmm. Those were just the things that popped up right now. There's probably more to it, but...
Right. In capitalism, right? In this system that we live and work within, how do you create something like Prospect? How do you work as a therapist? How do you work in any heal field under late-stage capitalism and maintain alignment with your ethics, maintain alignment with the pieces that are important and like the reason that so many of us come into this work? It sounds like the 2 of you are doing this. How are you doing it?
I think that's a complicated answer. I think this is a conversation that Abby and I have often. Whether this is in this project or for ourselves individually, I think we need to think about what is our relationship to late-stage capitalism, and how do we want to continue to be in this dynamic, right? Because we can't escape it. It's a reality. We have to recognize that this is a reality, and yet we are trying to do something different. We are trying not to hoard all the resources and keep it for ourselves, or compete with one another so that we think that because there's only a limited amount of resources, or like all of the things that come along with capitalism, right? Or focus so much on productivity and efficiency that we're not tending to ourselves, have some more slowness and ease with ourselves in relation to this work. But also there's times where we're like, yeah, we're not doing that because we don't have capacity, or this has been too much. We need to pause. We need to slow down. We need to kind of slow down that project or this side of things, and really trying to have more of those conversations. Do we have it figured out? No. Do we constantly have these conversations? Yes. And I think that's part of it, is like we are living in a system which is made for us to fail, and made for us to really be in the struggle and see that there is no choice, right? And what we're trying to do is think about, little pockets of choice, or little pockets of agency, little pockets of joy and playfulness and intentionality. And I think for me, a lot of it has to do with ease and slowness too, and relationality. Like, how do we do this work in relationship to each other? It's hard to do anything like a private practice or a project when you're in isolation, especially dealing with late stage capitalism, because it's just so hard to make sense of what's happening, how it's happening. And we can very much get caught up in greed. I trust Abby to come at me and go, hey, not come at me, but like, invite me into like, yeah. And also I'd also be okay with Abby coming at me too, because we have love for each other in that sense. But we're in relationship with each other to go, hey, what's going on? Like, what's going on with you? This isn't, aligned with how you want to be in the world, or this is sounding differently. And having those tough conversations with each other with, again, like respect and dignity, because we care about each other. So I think it's about, again, that piece around community, connection, relationality too.
The question that always comes up for me that I try to ask myself a lot when we're doing this work is, what is enough? Because I don't think we ask that question enough in this society, because it's like coming back to what Bhupie was saying around hoarding, right? That the basis of that is that we don't know what's actually enough. And so we continue to take more and more and more, right? So one of the pieces is like thinking, like, what is enough? Another one of those pieces is, as Bhupie is talking about, like community, collective care. If we have enough, then the excess that we have, how do we build systems that make sure that not only I have enough, but everybody around me has enough, right? What does that look like? How can we collaborate in that way so that that's in the structure of the work that we're doing together? And then the final thing is like, where Like, where are my ethics, and what do I need to do to unlearn the things that get in the way of me enacting of my ethics? That's a first reaction, is like capitalist notions of, oh, I need to get this done, or I need to make sure that I'm getting like what I deserve from this, and it doesn't matter who else is might be in the process or whatever. And so like slowing those urges down and going, okay, my ethics are telling me I need to have consent, I need to have relationship, and so how do I make sure that those pieces are in place? And I think the best way to do that, see, capitalist language, best way, I don't know, the one way that we do it here is through relationship.
Yeah.
Right? Like Bhupie's talking about.
The pieces that is kind of standing out more broadly is this idea of ease, slowing down, rest, almost like doing less. Even when you said the best way, oh, there's capitalism again, one way. What a huge shift in the way we think about things, or in the way in language. It's a small phrase change from the best way to one way, and it just opens my perspective even listening to you. So I'm thinking about these things, and I'm thinking about something, Bhupie, you touched on earlier, trauma work, right? The idea of that trauma is in our bodies, trauma is within us. It's something for us to work on and process. Are those two things connected?
I think the thing that's interesting about all of this is I find that the trauma field, capitalism is very much taking hold of it and benefiting from it. Now, this idea of like all of us being traumatized by our clients, and therefore we need to go to workshops and trainings and do all sorts of yoga and all sorts of this kind of thing to reprocess, all the trauma we're experiencing. Our clients are traumatized. Everyone's traumatized, really. And if you don't have any trauma training, guess what? You can't do any trauma work. So you need to take like 4 different workshops to feel qualified to do this work. So there's like a lot of like external kind of pressures that are built by capitalism to feel like you need to buy things, you need to do things in order to be human with each other, really.
Like it's like monetizing trauma.
Yeah, very much, right? Like every profession is now learning how to work with traumatized individuals because we're all traumatized. Not everyone who experiences violence will be quote unquote traumatized, right? I think that's a known thing, but it's not a known thing, A. And B, this idea that you have to reprocess your trauma, or you need to process it, or whatever it is, to be healed. Sometimes I have folks come into working with me and they're like using that language, but as we're exploring things, we're like, we're not ready to go there. Like, yes, I've got, some of those trainings and things like that where we're like, we can do this or we can do that. And as we're chatting and getting to know each other and they're working on what's going on in their life, they want to do advocacy work, or they want to do some sort of relational work. And by doing that, they're like, Bhupie, it doesn't bother me anymore. It doesn't impact me in the same ways. I don't really know what happened. And as we're kind of unpacking that, it's like, okay, being in a relationship with someone, such as a therapist, where there's some sort of level of safety, you've been able to explore what you want and need, slowly start to like, and you always knew this, it's just sometimes we're not in safe enough spaces to be able to kind of have those conversations. Figured out that stuff is showing up in your life, and now you're feeling differently. And you're also acting your agency maybe to advocate. And that is your processing of your trauma. I don't know. Like, I think we need to really think about these ideas of like one way of doing the work, one way of healing. And that's very much like colonial kind of ideas around this is a standardized gold, star way of doing this. These are the things that we're taught often. For some people, trauma work is, if we're using that language, dance. It's being out in nature. It's, laughing with a friend or a loved one. It can be anything. It isn't always talk therapy. It isn't always, doing kind of individual work in a sterile, office space. But that's what we're sold.
I literally just had this conversation yesterday in a clinical supervision group, so I'm so glad this is coming back up, right? This idea in our profession, we have an idea that we have to go into the details. We have to go into the past in order to resolve whatever it is, right? That's a very like psychodynamic kind of way of looking at things. But there's more than one way to heal. There's so many folks who are healing in all sorts of different ways. I guess this kind of ties back into oppression, and whenever there's oppression, there's always resistances. And so like, what are the resistances that folks are already enacting to the things that's happening? And then even drawing back the assumption a little bit that trauma is oppression, right? Like there's no delineation of that. Like why is everybody traumatized, quote unquote? There must be something that's larger in the system that's happening for quote unquote everybody to be traumatized, right? And then also thinking about like, sometimes therapy is a way for us to practice identities that are not trauma identities. There's so much more to everybody that like, if we just zone in on the trauma, that becomes their narrative. You're writing their narrative for them. A very monolithic way of understanding themselves. What if therapy was also about practicing joy? Like practicing like how to be in this world, practicing how to build relationships with each other. I have sessions where I talk to folks about like the video games they really enjoy because it enacts on like the stories that they're wanting to have in their life, right? That too can be trauma work. It could be healing work, whatever we want, what label we want to put on them. And so really critiquing those ideas, I think I'm just building on what Bhupie, you're saying around like thinking about the assumptions that we hold, and anything that you think you should probably look at a little bit. Not should. You can probably look at a little bit and see what else is out there. If we're talking about like another ethic that we have is like queering therapy, right? This is what I feel like is queering therapy in practice. When there's only one option or when there's two options, let's open it up and see what other options there are, what other ways we can enact together and build together.
It sounds like what you're describing is almost a step beyond the idea of being client-led. It's like client collaboration. It's a collective kind of co-discovering together experience. I'm imagining somebody comes in for therapy and they're using this language of, I have trauma, I need to process it. Where do you begin with this person in discovering what healing might look like for them?
I think for me, it starts with slowing down. I think often there's a sense of urgency of like, and I don't mean like, don't do anything, but I think it's like slowing down and getting an idea of what is the person saying. So when they're saying, I am traumatized, I need to process this, what do they mean by that? Where did that information or those ideas come from? What tells them that they need to kind of process? What's going on in their life right now that's kind of maybe indicating that? What are some of the things that they like to see different maybe? Or what are some of the things that are going well even, despite all of this? It just requires some level of understanding and slowing down. What are the things that, the things that are showing up as struggles alongside the quote unquote trauma? What are the things that are, shifting things a little bit? That might give you indication of, like when Abby's saying the resistances, like what are the resistances that are happening that you can build upon? And so kind of having more curiosity in the beginning with some openness, some curiosities, rather than moving into a direction right away, can really support us to kind of understand what's actually happening. I think as therapists, we have this sense of urgency to make things better, air quotes, right? Like, and that is built upon the idea that we are the experts and we are going to fix. So if we are deconstructing that and really recognizing that our job is to provide a container or a space where people can actually talk about what they need to talk about, and not to say we're like a blank slate, we're human beings and we bring ourselves to the work too, that they have the solutions and they have the answers, then what does my agenda have anything to do with anything? So let's slow down. If they go, okay, I want to process trauma, I'm like, okay, I know how to do EMDR here, let's go ahead and do this. Like, that is me just going, this is how we want to go about doing it. let's slow down. Let's figure out what it is they actually want. Again, naming the invisible stuff that might have, supported them to come to this place of, this is what I need to do. And often when I start to have these conversations, they're like, I don't know, my partner said this, or my doctor said this, or my so-and-so said this, that I need to have this particular modality to solve, whatever is going on for me. And I'm like, but what do you think about it? And then slowly we start to unpack things and going, that's really interesting, right? Like, as you're starting to name some of the things that we assume we all have the basic understanding of, or like, you know what I mean? Like, define some of these things that we're trying to figure out, deconstruct some of these things, we actually realize that may not be the path they actually want to go if they had some consent and autonomy and choice, right? And then there's time, and that comes from a place of like really noticing that when we move towards action immediately, I noticed that myself having to backtrack a lot and being like, what's going on? Why isn't this helping? You know what I mean? Like, why isn't this getting towards where the client wants to go or has named? It's because I haven't taken the time to actually be curious, to slow down, to understand and unpack some of these things. Because when people say trauma, we all go, okay, great. Mm-hmm. And we don't even take the time. Yeah, I know that. And we don't even take the time to understand, what do they mean by that? How is that showing up for them?
Yeah.
And asking kind of other questions of like that resistance to some of that, because we can get caught up in the trauma story and not see anything outside of it either.
I wrote down here resistance as healing trauma, because so many of the things that you're saying do go against what we're taught in our trainings, what we're taught in school around, like you mentioned, EMDR, or I'm curious to get your thoughts on somatic work, because that's another kind of big one right now. And the shift that you're describing from focusing on the trauma story and shifting into where are the even small pieces of resistance, where are the small pieces of joy, and also what does the word trauma, when you say, I need to work through my trauma, what does that actually mean to that person? All feels incredibly important. I asked my audience before this episode if there were any questions that they had, and the number one thing that I was seeing over and over again was folks asking about how to find some sort of balance between taking care of themselves, doing the things that they need to do, disconnecting perhaps from social media, from everything, the news, everything that's happening in the world, how to balance that with staying informed when the staying informed piece feels traumatizing.
I think one of the things that we didn't probably define is like this idea of resistance and what we mean by that. When I was kind of saying we're alive today because of our ancestors and our communities and ourselves, and that is because they have resisted throughout times. Like, it's not a coincidence that we're here today. So folks have been resisting oppression and violence always, and we will continue to do that. And we do that in all multiplicity of ways that may not make sense to you or me, and the ways that we've been taught to look at some of those resistances as pathology or a problem. Ooh. So like a common one, dissociation, quote unquote. People dissociate as a form of resistance to stay alive. Mm-hmm. Another one, common one, using substances, even something like fentanyl. Mm-hmm. That can be a form of potential resistance to stay alive and to be on this planet. And I'm not saying that's always the case. It could be like all sorts of kinds of things, right? Like that people, but often we're not trained to look for those. We're trained to look for the problems that people have and we can kind of diagnose with, so to speak. We have this very much like, what is wrong with you idea? And we're very quick to pathologize anything that might be beautiful. But really honing in on how have you been able to get through that, get through it, and how do you continue to do that? Not that simple question of like, tell me how, like it's like some curiosities that you have. around that piece to be able to highlight that, to be able to pick that up, to be able to hear that when that's showing up, and to start to understand the purpose of certain kinds of behaviors that may not make sense to us. So there's a lot of, or to some folks. So sometimes the things that are bringing people to therapy are forms of resistance as well that is no longer useful to them in the same ways as it was before. And maybe it was useful to them before and now it isn't. And now it's like, okay, I want to look at this again. And so instead of going, that's ridiculous that you're doing that, or there's a problem with it, but to really understand the purposefulness and the usefulness of that can really let us know a little bit more of what they're needing or wanting more in their life, you know, and can kind of land us into a place of how do we do this quote unquote trauma work together. I just want to take some time a little bit to talk a little bit what we mean by resistance. Again, resistance is seen as a bad thing sometimes when clients don't talk to us or, you know, they don't comply, quote unquote. Those are beautiful forms of resistance, of them saying no. So what has them saying no? You know, like, and how can we understand that no better that tells us what they need? You know, rather than, again, they're not ready for therapy, or there's, you know, like, we could talk about resistance like for an hour or two, but I'm just giving some very general, basic kind of examples of that I think is important to understand. What we mean about working with trauma is understanding some of those things too. And so when you ask that question about like, how do we have that tension between staying informed and tending to ourselves? Well, there's no simple answer, A. B, which is hard for people, I think. Sometimes people are like, I just want to know the answer. But I have some curiosities more than anything else. And I'm probably not going to be able to say them all together right now. So Abby, please help me out. But I think, how do we stay engaged in something and rest, but not rest so long that we never get back to it? You know what I mean? Because it can become an excuse not to get back to something because it's too much, right? But how do we also recognize what's happening for ourselves that might change our relationship to that nuance, right? Maybe you're going through a huge loss in your life. Maybe this is something that is actually quite personal for you. You know what I mean? That you may need more rest or more connection or more time away from it and then come back and re-engage. What does re-engaging even look like? You know, you could be strategic about it. What does action even look like? And what does even rest look like? Sometimes it's not disengaging. Sometimes it's being able to have, I don't know, for me, sometimes it's really dark humor and, you know, having some laughter with a friend or something and then coming back to it, you know? So kind of really thinking about some of these pieces in different ways and different forms rather than having the one-way answer. But I think if you're finding yourself just disengaging a lot and not coming back, then I kind of wonder about my complicity. Like, am I being complicit here? And then there's some of us who really are hard on ourselves and will put ourselves through a lot. Am I punishing myself? Because again, sometimes accountability gets shifted. Accountability is like, how do we actually be accountable versus punishing ourselves? And in a carceral system, we've been taught to really punish ourselves. So for some folks, they end up going, no, I just got to consume all of this information, regardless of how much this is impacting me, and don't, you know what I mean? Don't have that understanding. So this is why I say it's so hard to have a one answer to this question, but more reflections of who are you in relation to this work? How do you engage in accountability? Because that's what we're talking about, right? Like when we say we want to stay informed, it is to try to be accountable and try to have some actions that follow that accountability, right? Not just because we want to only build awareness. We want to have some accountability with that awareness. And so how do you engage in that process while, being your own human being and in relation to that?
I think that ties back into like what we were talking about with trauma too, right? Like there's the idea of using like EMDR or somatic work. I'm not saying those are bad things that we never do. It's like secondary to the basis of what we're looking at, right? Like if this is the way that you want to go, we can use these as tools. It's like kind of this balance, this tension between like, okay, how do you explore what is actually useful in this moment for you in order to do the thing that you need to do. And those tools can be anything that you choose. There's a playground full of tools for you to choose from, right? And then in terms of the piece of balance, one thing that's standing out to me as you're speaking, Bhupie, is I read this somewhere. I think it was Dean Spade who said this. Dean Spade is a trans lawyer and activist, that in the past, when we got bad news, we were already in community because somebody would have come to tell you. You were already in community when bad news happened. Right now, we're getting all our bad news on the phone alone, right? And so I think about not maybe the thing that's missing, the thing that's popping up for me is, how do we grieve together in this time? Rather than just consuming all of this and go, I don't know what to do with all of this by myself. You're not supposed to be by yourself, I don't think. I think you're supposed to grieve together. So when you're taking in all this information, maybe some of the balance can be, who do you grieve with? And from that grief, like, what comes from it? This is not mine. I can't remember where I got this from, but grief is love with nowhere to go. So like, where does your love want to go? And sometimes that love is resistance. Sometimes that love is accountability. Sometimes that love is like community and collective care. These ideas around like, what is beloved community? How do we build relationships throughout all of this? What are those really human things that we have forgotten about that helps us to survive this? And like tying back to what Bhupie was saying about like our ancestors doing all sorts of resistances and all sorts of relationships. What did they know that we can also tap into and build upon? Because we have a responsibility to continue to resist. Disconnecting is not necessarily wellness. You can't heal in isolation.
The idea of grieving with is making me think of another question that I got, which was around being in partnership when both folks or all folks are struggling. The question was how to support a struggling partner when you are also struggling.
Struggle together? I don't know if there's when I hear that, I hear an assumption of like one person has to be okay in order to support someone else. I don't know if that was like, that's just something that popped up in my mind. There's a lot of ways that we can struggle together. And I think there's a lot of beautiful things that can happen when you're struggling together, when you're like, what is that saying? Misery loves company. Sometimes struggling together is the way, right? Like we can like, Vicky always says, howl at the moon together.
I think there's also like this idea of sometimes the conversation isn't only about how do we struggle together. It's also recognizing what else might be playing a role. Some of the folks that sometimes I'm supporting are struggling together because they're dealing with ableism and a lack of support. And so it's not a failure on their part or something that they're not doing enough of, but there's some contextual pieces that are, again, impacting their ability to be able to be with each other in the struggle in the ways that they would want to. And so I think this conversation around like, how do we do that is complicated. But yes, I think there is that space of like struggling together and being together that it's almost like this idea you only have limited amount of resources. And so if I'm struggling, then I have nothing. And sometimes like using like spoon theory or, like all of there is some of that pieces. Sometimes there isn't. And for some people, even though they have no spoons, they still do something and that makes them actually feel differently in relationship to their spoons, So there's some different kinds of conversations we can have around that piece. But I think right now, given like how things are kind of moving forward, where there's so much harm and violence towards racialized communities, to queer communities, to folks, and there's genocide happening throughout the world. Like there's so much happening that it's almost like this idea of, I just need to do self-care better, and then I will be better and I will be okay. I think it's okay for us to struggle at times and feel not so great and like you can, but while recognizing that that doesn't have to be the only thing that I ever experience in my life too, or in that moment. Like, I can feel like that helplessness or that hopelessness too. But I can also feel the joy of like connecting here in this space and having these conversations and going, there's something happening else outside of that too. There's like multiplicity of experiences that we can have. So when you say when folks are struggling together, I'm like, are there any other also experiences that are happening together that are being erased in that struggle together? So there's like a lot of thoughts that are going in my head when you say that. I think it's that assumption that like someone needs to get better in order to like support the other. But the other thing is like, you know, when we're in community together, hopefully there isn't just the folks that we're in relationship and the intimate relationships we're with, that there's other folks involved who we can also invite in. And sometimes they're struggling too, but maybe one of them has the spoons to make some food, you know, like, or like bring some ingredients for food. And the other one is like, okay, I'll chop the vegetables. I don't know, like, you know, whatever it might be, you know, we can come together and be very messy. And it needs to be, I think, again, it's a lot of individualization, even within the relationships, right, that we're in, that this is the relationship that's supposed to be able to help and support me completely, you know, or these are the relationships, if we're talking about like poly or different kinds of relationship structures. But I mean, relationships outside of that, like friendships, other people, you know, like those are relationships too that matter. That might be people who have more, or that day or that moment can, you know, come and support us in our relationship, if that makes sense.
The thing that is popping up for me as you're speaking, Bhupie, is how a lot of this was taught to us by the disability justice community. And so something to look into as well for folks who are listening. Like these are resistances that have been well practiced by folks who have endured a lot of ableism and like disconnection in community.
Is what you're saying that a sort of honoring of your moment to moment experience in a way? Because you're describing that it's okay to struggle, it's okay to grieve, it's okay to feel not okay, and it's okay to feel moments of joy and connection and laughter and, you know, all of the things we would consider opposite of struggling. And almost the balance is in allowing for both.
Or multiplicity.
Or multiplicity, right, yes.
I think I'm reminded of some young folks I worked with a while ago, and they would say things like, I've sat in the shit long enough, it's kind of getting dirty. I just want to sit with it now, right? Like, I don't want to sit in it, I just want to sit with it. And it's like, okay, that makes sense, right? Like, sometimes we need to sit in the shit. Sometimes we don't want to sit in the shit anymore. And it's kind of, sorry for this language, but it's
no, it's
it was
great.
Perfect
I'm like, okay,
language.
I have an image.
But like, how do we learn to sit with it too? Because sometimes it's going on in our lives, and sitting with it means there's other things I'm sitting with as well. You know, that there can be, again, this stuff that's happening, but there's also this stuff that's happening, or that, or, you know. And again, there is no one size fits all, no one answer for each person. And I think that's the hardest thing for us as therapists, is like, we're constantly looking for the one answer. But if you had the one answer, wouldn't it be great? And people would have figured it out a long time ago. But it's about finding the answer that best works for that person in front of you, or those folks in front of you, and having some curiosity about that. Like, okay, you know, I'll have students or therapists come to me. I have a client, they're not moving through this. And I'm like, okay, I want them to move faster, and be like, okay, maybe they need to be sitting in the shit for a little bit. I don't know. I'm just saying, like, can we start to deconstruct this idea of change needs to happen this way, movement needs to happen this way, grief needs to happen this way, struggles need to happen this way, that they have to be linear and they move at this pace. And sometimes we know change is not linear. Our connection to struggle is not linear, and things move in all sorts of shapes and ways that we have to make permission for.
I'm just reminded of, like, a lot of this is the assumption of the right to comfort, and that the ultimate goal is that we are going to feel better. I don't know if feeling better is how I would personally define what my reaction to everything that's happening is supposed to be. I'm not sure that's the goal for me personally. And I don't know if, sometimes there's space for us to critique that a little bit and ask whether or not feeling better is really where we want to be going right now.
Mm-hmm.
And in questioning those assumptions, like what opens up for us in our struggles, in the ways that we're relating to struggling even, like what is our relationship with struggle if our assumption is not that feeling better is where we're supposed to be going.
Can you give some examples to kind of paint a picture of what maybe sitting with versus sitting in might look like, or what a different relationship to struggle that's not, well, the goal is to not struggle. Can you give some examples?
I think from a theoretical framework, it's kind of like the times where people talk about sitting in it is when it's all encompassing.
Mm-hmm.
And that there is nothing else outside of that. And that often it takes away everything else. There's like, you can't see anything outside of that. You can't experience anything outside of that. Has been the way that it's been described to me. And then the way that I see sitting with it is more around, there is this stuff happening, and sometimes I have this touch and go with it where maybe, like, at least that's been my experience of sitting with stuff, is it is all encompassing for a few moments or an hour or a day or 2 weeks. But then I'm able to come back out of it and go, okay, now I'm not sitting in it anymore. There you are, my friend, like you're here.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tap into it a little bit. I can touch the edges. I can decide how I want to sometimes I can decide, sometimes I can't. But there's also all of this other thing that's happening too. It might be something that I really enjoy. It might be something I feel very neutral about. And I don't it doesn't always have to be like rainbows and butterflies of other things that are existing. Maybe you notice a bird,
Mm-hmm.
flying around. So like, it's not just that darkness or that, that thing that you notice. You start to notice other things as well that are happening in your life. And I think for me, that's the distinction of sometimes we do need to sit in it because maybe we need to be in it first and long enough. And then we can come out of that, of an all-encompassing experience to be able to go, I watched a bird and that didn't necessarily like evoke joy. It's just like, maybe it evoked some interest or something. It might be like seeing something funny happen. Depending on who the person is, sometimes it can be other things, like I'm actually able to hang out with my friend for, even though we're not talking about what I'm going through, they were talking about their stuff. And I was just like half there, half not, but it was kind of nice to be in their presence. It's just like having other experiences outside of just that thing. But like Abby said, I think there's something kind of interesting to think about, is this idea of we're supposed to feel better when the world is kind of fucked up. Isn't that twisted? To kind of go, if everything is fucked up and I'm supposed to be like, yeah, everything's good.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not saying like, we have to be in the despair of it all either, right? Like I think there's layers, there's pieces. We need to ask questions, not come to an answer fully either. So I think that's something to consider. And even in therapy, we're often taught how to teach clients to be okay with the violence they are experiencing and to be okay enough. That seems really fucked up to me too.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. And so sometimes when people and their mind bodies are showing up and they're going, this is fucked up, it's kind of like, yeah, it is. Right? Versus, yeah, you shouldn't be feeling that. Let's change that.
It's setting us all up to fail in a way.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong. There's things that we might do, right? Like there's things that we might do to tend to ourselves. And it's not like one extreme over the other. But I think this idea or that assumption of us having to move towards that doesn't give us a lot of consent and choice when we're talking about trauma-informed practice, but also, like you said, sets us up for failure.
Yeah. And missing out on a lot of stuff in there too, right? Like at Bhupie, as you were talking and naming all the other things that could have been, I think even in struggle, there's a lot that I hold dear to that experience. Like, the fact that I am struggling about this reminds me of my ethics and like who I am and who I want to be, and my compassion and my humanity. Like, those things are really important to me. I hold those things sacred. And so if I was okay, and the only thing I was focused on is how to be okay in the face of all the shit that's happening, I don't know if I would have those pieces that I hold so dear about myself, that are so like core to my identity. You know, outside of, there's multiplicity, but also within that particular experience, there's multiplicity. So like, where does that land for you? What are the things that you hold dear about this experience that actually shows you a side of you that is really, really important that you don't want to let go of? Because if we think about it in that way, feeling better costs that. Here's capitalism language again. And that cost is too high. Like, I'm not willing to give that up.
We have covered so much in this conversation that my next and final question feels almost impossible, but answer it if you'd like. If not, no problem. Is there one thing, if you could name one thing that in your work you wish everybody knew, what would it be?
It's so hard to choose.
Yeah.
I know.
I think it comes down to, like, there's a lot of things that we've normalized in our own experiences, in our own lives, based on our own lived experiences, based on our trainings and academia and all of these things, that I hope people take a moment to try to deconstruct some of that, to try to understand more of the air that we breathe, or the things that we've normalized, and that other people probably have normalized a whole bunch of other things that are going to sound kind of weird or like feel different, but how can we be open to that? Like, just really, really deconstructing and continuing to be curious and in that process. Like, I think whenever I have that thought go in my head of like, that's kind of weird, or that what's wrong there, like, or pathologizing, or any of my training kicking in, I'm like, gotta step back. How do I lean into curiosity? Because I know that that's something that I need to kind of continually bring in. And then the last thing I would say is, like, be human. This work is about human beings coming together and doing a lot of human work. I know we want to have all the right answers, and in my work, it's never been about the right answer. It's about the questions we're asking ourselves consistently, and the critique that we're engaging, like, in ourselves and our work. But like, it's less about the answers. We're not going to figure out the one right answer. We're not going to have the one right answer. And how do we be okay with that?
I think mine is really similar. Go play. Play with things that you don't think you're supposed to play with, and play in community. I know that's like 3 things, but like, go play with things that you're not supposed to play with in community. There we go. That's 1 sentence. That's close enough. Right?
Like, one theme, I'll take it.
Yeah.
We just have one in there somewhere, it works.
The core of this work is taking these really serious things, at least for me, the way that I'm understanding it is taking these really, really serious things and like Legos, taking them apart and then putting them back together in ways that maybe work better for us, bringing some joy and levity into some of these things that we're talking about, these really, really heavy things, and come at it with a perspective of experimentation. I think this is like a transformative justice thing of, we're not going to know, because we don't know the one right answer. We need to be able to be willing to experiment. So I think about when, I don't know if folks did this might be TMI, but when you were younger, you like just poured things into things and said, like, see what happens, like dish soap into like chocolate sauce, and then like you stir it up and see what that, don't drink that. But like, you know, like that kind of energy, you know, go play with community, play with things that you probably shouldn't be playing with, and see what happens.
We're queerifying it. Like, you've just described queerifying in like such a light, beautiful, fun kind of way. Before we jump into the extended version, where one of the things that I got questions about that we touched on is feelings of guilt around stepping away or tending to yourself. Before we go there, where can people find you if they want more?
Our website is prospectcounseling.ca. We also have a very inactive Instagram account that you can follow at prospectcounseling.com. I guess most of our community connection stuff is run through Reflecting on Justice, where we send newsletters and stuff every so often, or updates about program things. So you can follow Reflecting on Justice as well. That's where you can find us. Bhupie, did you have anything to add?
Maybe our email address, connect@prospectcounseling.ca.
I will link and list all of this in the show notes and in the description as well. Thank you both so much for your time and for your wisdom. I very much appreciate you taking the time to be here and to share with all of us.
Thank you so much for having us. This was fun.
Yeah, very, very cool. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. You can also access all of our extended cut episodes with bonus content from every single guest over on Patreon at patreon.com/AlaynaJoy. That's patreon.com/ALAYNAJoy. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at sleepingaroundpod for updates, teasers, episode discussions, and more. This episode was produced by Alayna Joy and Danae Fender and edited by Corey Mesquita. See you next time back here on the couch.